Okay, we're in Kashrus base. Halacha Gimel. Halacha Gimel is lo yaniach Keilim harbe l'soich kli v'yagilim yachad. The Mechaber says you shouldn't put a lot of Keilim into one bigger container and cash them all together. And the Ramah, whoever sticks in noigim zeh b'zeh after touching each other. And the reason is because the place where the Keilim touch each other is not going to get kasher properly. Therefore, you can't kasher. And halacha daled is the same thing, which is imagel b'tzavas. If you kasher using tongues, meaning you have a delicate, because you don't just dunk into the water, so you want to put it in carefully. So you hold on to it with tongues. You can't hold on with your fingers. So you hold on with tongues. You can't kasher with tongues. If you want to kasher with tongues, you galgal hakli. What you should do is you should rotate the kli. Means once you put it into the water, so the place where the tongues are touching doesn't have contact with the water. So you have to rotate the kli so that those spots get uncovered and now the other places get covered. The Moikane, because if not for that, if you won't rotate it, the water is not going to reach the place where the tongues will hold it. Okay, so these are both the same thing, which is that if things that are being covered and touched don't get kasher properly. Okay, and the very practical application of this thing is for a person cashing silverware. Okay, the person cashing silverware would love to just dump in 50 pieces of silverware in at once, but you can't because they'll all be touching each other. So you have to dunk them in one at a time. And we saw once beforehand that as you dump in Keilim, it cools the water off. So this is a separate thing, not related to our din, which is you're supposed to wait between the silverware for the water to come back to a boil. Okay, that's a separate thing. But from our din comes the very practical part of it, which is most people don't throw in 10 pots at once, but they would put in silverware. So instead of dumping the whole thing of silverware, you should dunk them in, put them in one at a time. Okay, and in Mir Hashem, next week we're going to talk about it in a very it's a practical industrial application system, okay, which is not an everyday application, but a practical industrial application of this thing. But the consumer application is the silverware. That's which is a normal thing. Come to Pesach, the whole thing is silverware, the kasher. Okay. But let's try to understand what's going on here. These two halachas are from two different early achronim or rishonim. The first is from Mordechai, and the Mordechai says like this. The Mordechai says, this is not a Gemara, it's a Mordechai. He says, the din is, in Hilchos Tfilas Keilim, that you're allowed to put Keilim inside of each other and tie with them like that. Okay? So he says, even though for Hilchos Tfilas Keilim that does work, even so for Hagol it doesn't work. That's all he says. He says, even though the Gemara in Chagiga says that it works for Tfilas Keilim, it doesn't work for Hagol's Keilim, and he doesn't really explain what the reason is. Okay? That's what we're trying to understand is, what's the reason? If you tell me that the water gets into Tfilas Keilim, so then it's getting for Hagol's Keilim. And if it doesn't get in for Hagol's Keilim, then it shouldn't get in for Tfilas Keilim. Okay, so what's the difference between them? He doesn't really say very much. We'll see that really he does, but on the surface, he doesn't seem to say any explanation. Okay, and it happens to be also that the Gemara there in Chagiga has a machlokes whether you should be choshish that the Keilim stay touching each other. When you put in two Keilim together, it should be choshish or not. And we're going with the assumption that you can do tefillah like that. That's what he's doing, which is really the din. It's brought in Shulchan Aruch that you really can tie with Keilim. That he's assuming that. In fact, it's a sort of a machlokes whether you can or cannot do that. The Gemara in Chagiga. Okay. Now this. The Gemara in Chagiga says. Machlokes that we passed him. That's okay. Well, it's a machlokes. It's hard to say whether. But the Gemara talks about whether that din in the Mishnah that Tovel and Keilim one on top of each other is for Kachim and for Tyrus and for certain kinds of Kachim, and there's a machlokes to say what pshat in the Mishnah is, and according to one of the pshatim it would be Asur, and according to one it would be Mutar. The Gemara says Lema Ketano, it's totally in a machlokes, and it seems to me that there's a machlokes. Okay, I can't say that 100% because in the Tzrichus it might not be like that, but it seems to me that it's a machlokes. Okay, and the din is that you're allowed to. Okay, so that tells us. You could tell me that if those who hold you not allowed to because I'm going to say it's because the Keilim touch each other, which is not pasha, but that's what it means. So then we wouldn't have a problem. That's why he wouldn't be able to do Hagol either. But his assumption, if he comes into the Gemara says you're allowed to. Okay, the Gemara that says that you're allowed to brings 2 days. One that says you're not allowed to. But he says the Gemara says that you're allowed to. So his question is if you're allowed to. So the question is if you're allowed to for tefillah, why not do it for Hagol? Okay, now the Gemara over there in Chagiga says tzrichusa. The Mishnah there has 11 cases of things that have special dinner for Kachim and Tyrus, and it says there's a machlokes had on the one that says that you can't toivel things together. It says you cannot do that. One person says it's because they touch each other. So the Gemara is trying to make it shichusa. Why is that not the same as a different definition that says something about tying things together? A different case of tefillah. So the Gemara says, because you would think, when you take two keilim and you put them into the water, then what happens is, just because of the nature of water, is that the top one is going to float off from the bottom one. By putting two things together, the top one's going to float up. So it just has to float up a drop. It's going to float up, and it will get surrounded by the water. So ma'u the tema, that this case is you're allowed to. You don't have to be choishes for it because it'll just float up. Kamash malon that the keilim might be heavy, and if they're heavy, they won't float up, and if we have a chashash. Okay? So at least we a little understand it. If we're going to say min hadin that you are allowed to be toivel two keilim together, it means like the havmin of the earlier Gemara, which is you're allowed to toivel because it does float up. Okay, the Gemara says ma'u the tema, if you hold it you're not allowed to do it. So it would be the chiddush is ma'u the tema that it'll float up. So if we're going to say halacha that you are allowed to do it, it's because we're going to say no, in fact it does float up. Okay, so now just to frame it. Yes, it floats up, so that's why you could type it. That's what we would guess. But now we're still with our questions. Why not Kashering?
Yes, you hold it with tongues, so you can say it's going to float up.
Okay, so right. So now, when we got so far, we couldn't see the din of tongues. The second din, we're on the first din. The second din, no problem. Tongues, not floating up. You're holding it tight. It's not going to float up. Good. That's correct. That's the Sefer Aruch. The Sefer Aruch doesn't even bring tefillas keilim. He doesn't. The second din, halacha dalet, because he doesn't bring the Sefer Aruch. He doesn't bring tefillas keilim because this has nothing to do with tefillas keilim. You wouldn't be allowed to toivel like this either. So he doesn't say in tefillah you're allowed to. For you can. Of course you can't do it because it's tongues. But the shayla is the first din. The first din says for tefillah. For tefillah you're allowed to do. What I'm describing here, you're allowed to do it for tefillah, but you can't do it for agolo. Well, what's the difference between them? That's what we're trying to say. And the second thing is, if you do a really heavy kli, like sort of the Gemara is being Muram is that if you had a really you had a blender, or you know what I mean, you had a really heavy kli, then it would be obvious why you wouldn't be allowed to do it either. But again, you couldn't do that for tefillah either. So if you put a heavy kli into another kli, you couldn't do it for tefillah either. So that then we now understand because they're touching and there's no water gets underneath it. But our shayla is halacha gimel is talking about. The Mordechai says halacha gimel is talking about a case where for tefillah it does work, but we're saying for hagol it doesn't work, and that's the question. What's the difference between them? Okay, I have to tell you. You could tell me the Mechaber doesn't say exactly. I don't think it says exactly what the Mordechai says. It says lo yaniach keilim harbe l'sarchli. Don't put a lot of keilim. So you could say that that's a case where there are so many keilim that they won't float up. Like imagine if you took a whole bowl of silverware, 50 pieces of silverware, keilim harbe, it's just not going to happen. It's like a heavy kli. You could say that's what the Mechaber means.
That couldn't do that for tefillah either.
And that for tefillah it wouldn't work either. Okay? You could read it. If you want to just read the din, you could say that that's what the Mechaber means. But as soon as you open up the relationship with the Mordechai, that's what this didn't come from. He says, even though it works for tefillah, I mean, he's talking about a case where, in fact, it does float up, even though it doesn't work for hagolo. So what's the difference? So what's going on there? Okay, so I'm trying to focus on that there's one case that we don't understand. Okay, so the truth is, you probably may have guessed the following answer. Maybe it's an obvious one I'm about to say, but I didn't get it until I saw the Gemara who says a thing, and he brings a Gemara which I don't know, I would have never guessed that this Gemara has anything to do with this, but the Gemara Mamash explains, and once you hear it, you'll say, oh, I could have said that without this Gemara. Okay, the Gemara in Pesachim says that if the Chameshes Minidagan, if you mix them with water, and you let them sit, they become chametz. But if you put it into boiling hot water, it doesn't become chametz. Okay, and in fact, it will never become chametz in that way, which we understand in our modern way of thinking is that the hot water kills the germs that cause fermentation, so it won't ferment anymore. That's what the Gemara says. If you put it into boiling water, it doesn't become chametz. Okay, so the Gemara says then that's a Mishnah. Then the Gemara says that if you even though you're allowed to do this, we don't do this anymore, but even though you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do more than one grain of wheat at a time, because wheat kernels have like a slit going down the middle, like a crack going down the middle. So we're concerned that one wheat kernel will get stuck in the crack of another one, and therefore that spot won't get, so to speak, cooked in the water. So you're not allowed to do this. Okay. Now, you could imagine, if you never saw a piece of wheat, you could imagine that there's this huge gaping hole in the middle of the wheat kernel, and that the other one's going to get stuck perfectly into it, that the water's not going to get to it, okay? But if the truth is, there's not such a big hole. You know, so you could imagine that it stays absolutely dry there, you know what I mean? But you could imagine that, you know what I mean? But in truth, it's hard to believe that that's what goes on. And So really, the thing probably, and we just saw in the Gemara in Chagiga that we talk about Keilim floating up when they get into the water. You could guess that the wheat kernels are going to float a certain amount of water. They might get a little stuck. There's a certain amount of getting stuck, but they're also pretty loose. Wheat kernels are not so heavy. So what's going on with the Gemara? So the word of the Gemara is L'sholek Lahu Dikul D'Mayim, which Rashi says is Resichas Hamayim. Okay, now Resichas Hamayim is not a literal translation of Dikul D'Mayim. Dikul D'Mayim means the flow of the water. Okay, so Rashi is not translating; he's explaining that when we say that the Dikul D'Mayim doesn't get into the thing, he means is that when you put one kernel by itself, the water is all around it, and all the Resichas Hamayim, all the power and the heat and everything of this water gets to all surfaces of the kernel. So it cooks it without letting it become chametz. But if the two things are, one is shielding the other one, this one is protecting this one, so then the part that's covered up might get wet, but it's not going to have the force of the water. There's something protecting it, so it'll get hot and it'll get wet, but it won't get boiling. And that's not good for chimetz. That's the worst thing for chimetz. When you heat things up and you make them wet, is what makes them become chametz. Things that are warm, that's why we use mayim shalom. The things that are warm become chametz faster. So by protecting this thing and putting it into the boiling water, you're not allowing the main flow of the water, the dikul d'maya, to get to there, which Rashi is saying, and memelo you're not getting the resichas hamayim. You're not getting the heat penetrating over there. It's protected, and therefore it will not have chalitza. It won't be prevented from chimetz. Instead, it will become chametz. Okay, that's what the Gemara means. So that Gemara is exactly what's going on in this din. For Tfilas Keilim, all you have to do is the kli has to be surrounded by water. Even the tiniest bit, even the tiniest bit is good enough to make it be total. So okay, so it gets wet. Who cares? As long as it gets wet, it gets wet. But when you put two Keilim inside of each other, then one floats up, but the other one is going to shield it. Just like the kernels of wheat shield each other, the one is going to shield the other one from the force of the heat, the strength of the heat coming into it, and it might not get kashrus in that spot, which is shielded by the other kli. So it'll get wet. It's going to get wet, but it's not going to get hot. So for what we need for Hagal's Keilim, we need it to get hot. And therefore, for Tfilas Keilim, it's fine, but for Hagal's Keilim, it's not. Okay? So there's two other things just to say. One is like this. The Gra is on Halacha Gimel. Halacha Gimel, he says this, see the Gemara over there that says this thing. Okay? And he ends off, the last words of the Gra is, V'zeh shekasav im maga v'chulu. Okay, which means is imago is the first words of Halacha Daled. So he's telling. So the simple reading is that the Gemara means to say is Halacha Gimel because of this Kabara, and that's the reason for Halacha Daled also. Like I don't need to tell you again Halacha Daled. The reason is the real halachas are the same. So V'zeh shekos is the next thing also because that's the simple reading of what he's trying to say. Okay, that's the simple reason. But if you think about it, I think that what he means to say is like this: Halacha Daled. Okay, Halacha Daled ends off with the word, and these words. The Mechaber says are straight from the Aruch, but the Halacha Daled ends off. You have to rotate the kli because if you don't rotate the kli, then the place where the tongues are holding loisolik dikul d'maya. Okay, so what he means to say is, well, I don't even know why he says it in Halacha Daled, but in Halacha Daled, nobody gets there at all. But what the Gra is telling you is these words loisolik dikul d'maya, which is mamish the words of the Gemara and Pesachim talking about the grains, is the pshat in Halacha Gimel. You want to know why, if there's two Keilim touching each other, you can't kasher it, is because, like the Gemara says in Pesachim, so the end of Halacha Daled is the pshat in Halacha Gimel. For the truth is, really for Halacha Daled, we don't need L'sol Dikul D'Mayim. It didn't even get wet. Forget about L'sol Dikul D'Mayim. The thing didn't even get wet. It's being touched by the tongues. But if you want to know the reason for really for Halacha Gimel, is because V'zeh shekasav, imagil v'chulu. If you go see the end of that din, L'sol Dikul D'Mayim, that's the reason. The reason why that Kashering doesn't work is like the Gemara says in Pesachim, L'sol Dikul D'Mayim, which is the end of the words of Halacha Daled that the Mechaber say. Okay, so that's the hezbollah. What's going on?
Isn't there a din by Zil's Keilim that you make your hands wet and hold on to the Keilim, make your hands wet in the mikvah, hold on to the Keilim?
That shows you how little water there has to be.
So if you use tongues, you can make the tongues wet and do the same thing.
Right. So you're telling me that in the case of tongues,
it wouldn't work. I mean, you would need that.
Yes. So you could say the word L'sol Dikul D'Maya to explain certain cases of tongues that for Tefillah would work. But yes, you're right. You could say that. But I'm saying even without having to be so sophisticated, the reason for Halacha Gimel is because of what it says, L'sol Dikul D'Maya, which is which is, in halacha the Aruch doesn't say, even though for tefillah it works for hagala. So you could say it doesn't mean cases like that. He could just say it means this, because your mama's holding it on tight and it doesn't get wet at all. You don't have to say that. But for halacha gimel, those words are so good, which is mama, it's the same words coming out of the Gemara Pesachim, is prat this din over here. Okay, that's what he's trying to say. And it's probably the first time that I can tell you, even though I don't know if it's true. When I went by Arbasher, he said once, he said once, when he was describing how someone should learn Be'im, because the description is that you have to learn it so well that you understand every v'chulu of the Gra. Okay, why did he say v'chulu? Okay, that was his description of how you understand something Be'im. Okay, now I don't know if I ever did that, but in this case, the Gra says, so I'm telling you what the v'chulu is. The imagil is to say that's Pshat Halacha Dal, and the v'chulu is the Mosol Tikul to mine. Okay, so now we understand the v'chulu of the Gra. Okay. So anyhow, that's one thing. Now the second thing is, the Mechaber says, you shouldn't use tongues. Halacha Dal says don't use tongues. If you're stuck and you have to use tongues, okay, we're making up a case that's a delicate clean, you don't want to drop it in. Okay, for whatever reason, you have to use tongues. So what do? You rotate the clean. Okay? So the Mishnah Berurah says here, and it's in the Bir Halacha before also, a very surprising thing. To me it was surprising. He says, better than rotating the clean, what the better thing to do is take your kli, put it into a basket that has holes in it, and then put the kli, dunk it in the basket. Instead of holding it with tongs and rotating it, put it into a basket that has a lot of holes in it. So it'll be a kli rishon. That's the point of that. And then dunk it in, holding the basket. Okay. So what's he talking about? What do you put into it?
Listen, what do you mean be a kli rishon?
The reason for the holes is that water will get in. If not, the water will dunk in from the top, and it may not be a kli rishon. So that's like a side point. That's what the Bir Halacha is going for. It won't be a kli rishon because
it's submerged.
So if it's submerged, then it has to reboil, whatever it is. I'm sorry, I'm distracting you. Okay. So the Mishnah Berurah says you should put it in with a kli with holes in it, and you put it in like that. So what is he talking about? These two dinim are that you're not supposed to touch the kli. So we just said, don't put Keilim inside of other Keilim. What are you telling me? Instead of rotating, which sounds like a great idea, rotate the Kli means, today, I'm holding it over here, now hold it.
Now he says this is better.
Yeah, he says it's better, you should put it into something that has holes in it. What are you talking about? What the whole did here is that you should not put things in with holes. The whole point is to not put Keilim out of each other. So,
what's around in there or something?
Hello, that was halacha gimel. So that would have been okay. So where something seems to be missing over here. The Mechaber seems to have a good answer. Rotate it so it touches it on one spot and then touch it on another.
Where's he bring it from?
It comes from Chokagel, okay, and it has. So what's going on over here? Okay. So to answer the question, I'm going to tell you a kasha Rabbi Shulchan asks. Okay, and we'll answer both of these questions here. Rabbi Shulchan asks. He really said halacha gimel. He says is, you're telling me the Keilim can't touch each other. He says we're going to see in a few halachos, and we've seen it before also, that hagala means the parts that have contact with the food. The water of the hagala has to touch those sides. Water of hagala doesn't have to touch everything in the kli. Let's say the kli is an inch thick. The water of the hagala doesn't have to touch the middle of that, the thickness of the kli. We assume that the bli went in from, let's say, the inside, so the water that penetrates will go from the inside to Kashrus also. But the water has to touch wherever water touched. So, for example, if you have a ladle, that the ladle gets liquid on both sides of it, you can't just kasher it on the inside. You have to kasher it on the inside and the outside. But what halacha above is if you have a pot, there's only water on the inside. So then what you have to do is you have to fill up the whole inside, and the din of is going to say that you have to make sure that it goes into the very top. Because the top, it's very hard to get water on the top, so it tells you how to make sure you get water on the top. But you don't have to get water on the outside. That's what his point. It doesn't say you get water on the outside because no water goes onto the outside. Okay, except we had all the halacha about what happens if it spritzes. So but assume, because if it spritzes, then you have to be cautious that the water that was on the inside also came in from the outside. Okay, but in a normal case, only the water has to be only on the side that has alcohol, and especially on those sides. Okay, you can't cash from the wrong side. You have to only cash from the right side. So what Traeger says, what's the problem in halacha gimel? You put a lot of keilim together. If let's say I take a basket. I take a basket and I put in 4 cups into it. Okay, what's going to touch each other? The outsides of the cups are going to touch each other. He says, well, if the outsides of the cups touch each other, there won't be a kashering on that part. He says, so who cares if the outsides of the keilim get kashered? If the outside of this touch the outside. Imagine these two things are cups. So the outside of this touches the outside of this. So those spots don't get kasher. Who cares? The trays is on the inside of the cup, and the inside of the cup is full of water. So what's the difference if the outsides touch each other? Those don't have to be kasher together. Now, it's easy to kasher the insides, like dunking it into water. But I don't have to get the outsides wet. Who cares if they have? That's his kasher.
So this is a kasher by cups, right? I mean, there's like four spoons and forks.
So the answer is, the answer to this kasher is, which is then Aruch is trying to point out, is that the Mechaber's din is talking about cases, let's say, for silverware. Because the other is on both sides. I don't even know if he means it as a kasha, or at least just to focus you. That's what it is.
I mean, the silver can go on the inside of the spoon.
Let's say the inside of a spoon, right? You can touch the inside of a spoon. Or I'm saying, a spoon gets, when you stick the spoon into the noodles, the spoon's getting bleeders from both sides. Or he means the cases where you take Keilim, and let's say you put them in concentrically. Meaning not that you have 4 cups going in that are touching outside, but if I put a big pot with a little pot inside of it and another pot inside of it, so there, the problem is not that the higher cups outside doesn't get kashered, it's that the lower cups inside doesn't get kashered. Because if the outside touch, if these two things are top each other, not that this one is the problem is the bottom one, it's being covered, part of it is being covered, it's not getting kashered. Okay, so that's the answer to this question, but it's focusing, the Shaker is telling us that these dinim are talking about cases like that, where there's a part of the kli that touches the food that won't get kasher, as opposed to if you put 4 cups side by side, there wouldn't be a problem. Okay?
What does the Keilim say?
He doesn't say. He leaves it off as a kasher. Okay? But l'chayra, the answer to his question is, his question tells us that the Mechaber is only talking about certain kinds of cases. Okay? So with that, we can understand. In halacha daled, if you kasher something with tongs, that means is that tongs cover the outside of the kli and the inside. The tongs have to grasp it from both sides. So when you use tongs, you're covering it from both sides. So the Mishnah says, so instead, take your individual kli and put it into a basket, and then lower the basket in. But when you lower it in the basket, the part that's going to be covered is the outside of the kli. There's nothing wrong with the outside of the kli gets covered. So these dinim about not covering over part of the kli, they don't mean you're not allowed to put it into a basket, because if you put it into a basket, the only thing that doesn't get touched is the outside. Who cares? The outside doesn't have to get touched. Then we're just where you put things inside of each other, or they're touching each other in ways like that. But if it's just an outside of a kli, big deal.
So how do you know Mr. Brewer is talking about the type of Keilim, like a pot, maybe? He's talking about
so you assume, right, you're right. So now we'll have to say that he's only talking about, so to speak, a normal thing that you'd want to use tongs for, which is like a pot, or a dish, or something that's more...
Is it on the halacha of tongs?
Yeah, on the dinner of tongs. No, because there's where the Mechaber says, instead of using tongs, you should rotate the kli. Because in the halacha dinner, it said don't put a lot in, do them one at a time. But the halacha daled said you should rotate. He said rotating is not such a good idea. I don't know why. Rotating is not such a good idea. Instead, do this. So instead is, we'll have to say what he means is, he just instead put one kli into a basket and then dunk it in, and what won't get touched will be the outside. Okay, so with that we'll be able to understand what I don't know why it's better, but at least why it works. I don't know why it's better than rotating the kli, but at least it'll explain to us why.
You look at the towers of the Chagag,
I don't remember what they said. I don't remember what they said, but the problem is on why this is better. Okay, but I'm saying that this thing we had about Rabbi Krieger, this Kasher Rabbi Krieger, what pointed us to help us understand what's going on here. Okay, and Mir Hashem will do next week a practical case, for some people it's practical, industrial application of this, which it's really going to be more of a chance for us to talk about how that kli works and how to kasher it. But it has to, of all things that it has to do is, what it has to do.